Hey everybody, all right, welcome back from lunch. This is gonna be Lilly Ryan. She is a penetration tester and recovering historian from Australia. Let's give a hand for Lilly.
Hey folks, thank you for coming to my talk. I can promise you lots of drama and backstabbing and poetry and useful lessons, but before I do that, I want to talk to you about two things. One of these is these slide changes here, which you might not be able to see at the back, but trust me, they're there. Just for fun, and because it's a bit on theme, I've got two Telegraph keys. One makes the slides go forward, and one makes the slides go back. Sure. Because, normal slide clickers weren't going to cut it for this talk, so okay. The next thing is my slide background, which is, kind of subtle here, but I've done that on purpose. This is a reproduction of some authentic Victorian-era wallpaper that probably would have been in a rich person's house at about the time that my story takes place. And what I really like about this pattern is that if you entered a house that had it, your chances of dying would increase dramatically. Because this pattern, and a lot of others like it, were covered in arsenic. And arsenic would give you these really vibrant colors on wallpaper. So a lot of rich people plastered their houses in it. And I have color altered this one for safety reasons. So this sample is from a book called Shadows from the Walls of Death, which was published in 1874. And there are only 4 copies of this book left because most of them were destroyed in the interest of public health. And I really hope the people who digitized that copy are okay. Anyway, this doesn't really have anything much to do with the story that we're going to hear today, but I liked it. And if you're wondering about a lot of the toxic behavior that went on during this period, just remember that a lot of people were literally breathing toxic dust over breakfast. Now that I have all of that window dressing out of the way, let's move on. My name is Lilly Ryan. My career has existed at various points on the spectrum between historian and hacker, and I really like to talk about all of the weird things that went down in the past so that we can learn something from them. And I think that being able to reflect on the mistakes and the failures of the past helps us to build better teams in the future and to do better work. And the story I'm going to tell you today is one of the biggest failures in tech history. So I think that successful reflection comes in 2 halves. We want to understand how we got to where we are, and then we want to apply those lessons to where we're going next. And the problem is when a team only does the first half of this, which is what can often happen, we think about what we did, we don't take any lessons from it, and then we do it again. And you can get away with this for quite a long time if things are mostly going well. But when things go wrong, applying these lessons to future actions is usually the only thing that can pull you out of a bad cycle. And it's usually when our projects fail that they're thrust into the spotlight, even though we would really rather hide. Nope. Come on, Telegraph. It's very old. Nope. All right. Oh, that's why it's not working. There we go. No worries. Yes, so on the other hand, besides failing, when we succeed at something, that usually feels pretty awesome. One of my favorite things about the release of a successful project is the go-live celebrations. And it doesn't matter much to me if this comes in the form of an office party, or if the team slink off to a bar after work, or if you even get to have a go-live party or any celebration at all, because you're not sitting around waiting for a build pipeline to go green and lighting candles. And probably one of the best go-live parties on record happened in 1858 after the completion of the first transatlantic telegraph cable. And to understand why this one telegraph cable was such a big deal, I need to explain what a telegraph is, because it is hardware that is so old that it is not vulnerable to meltdown or spectre. And so most people here probably have not used one, probably. Anyway, that's a picture of a telegraph receiver. These are 2 telegraph keys. Normally you would only have the one. But basically, telegraphs were the first internet. In the Victorian era, people started to send messages to each other along copper wire using basic electrical pulses. And mostly they would use Morse code for this. This was a system of, short pulses and long pulses that corresponded to letters of the alphabet. So you'd write your message down in your alphabet, take it to the telegraph office, and an operator would key it in Morse, and someone at the other end would hear your series of long and short pulses as little clicks, and they'd write that down back in letters for the person who was meant to receive it. It was better than normal mail, because electricity can travel much faster than trains or horses. So telegraph messages got to their recipients much faster. And by 1858, North America and Britain had had nationwide telegraph systems for a few decades, and this was how most people domestically did business. But to send a message from Britain to North America, or vice versa, at this same period of time, it would take several weeks because you had to put it on a ship and literally sail it across the Atlantic Ocean. And this was why, when the world heard that there was now a telegraph cable that could connect the two continents, they went absolutely wild for it. The 1858 telegraph cable's completion was one of the most spectacular go-lives in history. On both sides of the Atlantic, people fired cannons and they let off fireworks and they danced in the streets and they wrote reams and reams of some of the worst poetry I have ever heard. Here's some. "'Tis done, the angry sea consents, the nations stand no more apart. With clasped hands, the continents feel the throbbing of each other's hearts. Speed, speed the cable, let it run, a loving girdle round the earth, till all the nations 'neath the sun shall be as brothers of one hearth." I assume that rhymed back in the day, but okay. There is heaps more where that came from, like a lot. I guess my point in telling you this is people really, really loved this cable. They loved it so much that they were still celebrating 3 weeks later. But the weeks of party hit a snag when the cool new telegraph cable went completely dead. So these days, when a big release goes bad, we usually have strategies in place. We don't always assume that things are going to work. We hope they will, but we plan for the worst. We might have thought of a way to roll the changes back, or we plan a soft launch just to make sure that things are really working. But the telegraph guys, they hadn't thought of anything except success. There was no fallback plan. There was just lots and lots of rage. And when the first person who wants to use your telegraph is the Queen, it's a bit of a stakeholder, you really feel the heat when things go wrong. So this project literally was going to change the world. We feel often that our projects are going to change the world, or we like to feel like that, and sometimes they do, We change people's lives all the time by rolling out stuff to make sure that the people who trust us with their business can do the things that they need to do. But this project, this Transatlantic Telegraph project, was going to change the world in a really huge and history-making way, like the invention of the car, or the internet, or Janelle Monáe's Dirty Computer album. This kind of makes all the fireworks and the cannon and the dancing understandable from a Victorian perspective. I do not find the poetry understandable, but we can put that one aside. But I hope this demonstrates how dramatic it got when this amazing cable just totally died. Because it's always a hard time when a project fails. And a lot of us have experienced this at one time or another. If you haven't, you almost certainly will. No matter how excellent the team is, or how good the idea is, not everything is going to go smoothly. But failures are also very valuable. For me, they have been the places where I have learned the most about myself, and I've gotten the most valuable feedback about myself as a team player, my technical strengths, and the ability of me and my team to bounce back when things go wrong. And I think that reflecting on your work is often richer after a failure. Asking yourself and your team, what did we learn, gives us really useful fuel for moving on. Unfortunately for the Transatlantic Telegraph cable team, 1858 was only 15 years after the first computer program was written. And it was 48 years before the first computer was built. Yes, that's not wrong. It was a time when the phrase agile retrospective would only ever be used to describe someone peeping over their shoulder as they sprinted down an alleyway looking for bad guys. So they really didn't have any models to learn from. But this doesn't mean that we can't still learn something from this project, which was one of the biggest tech delivery failures in history, because in many ways, this project formed the cornerstone of every modern delivery project. And the key person that we're going to learn these lessons from is this guy. This is Dr. Edward Orange Wildman Whitehouse. And in addition to having the best name and the wildest facial hair of his entire team, he was also the chief electrician of this Transatlantic Telegraph project. This is basically the tech lead. He was also the main architect of its demise. Whitehouse had a history as a doctor and a scientist and an inventor. When I did the research for this, I found a patent that he'd lodged for some roller skates, which could have been interesting. And he dabbled in telegraphy as one of his side projects. And he'd also patented a number of deviations on telegraph technology, which, in those days, that was basically like forking other people's repos and changing a single line and then calling it all his own work. Anyway, this had impressed Cyrus Field, who was this American businessman who was providing all the money for this big telegraph project. And so despite the fact that Whitehouse had no actual experience with implementing telegraph systems, he got appointed chief electrician of the Atlantic Telegraph Company. The main problem with the Transatlantic Telegraph cable was that nobody was really sure if it could actually be done. We'd had telegraphs for a while, but we'd never had something that went underwater, unbroken, for such a long way. This was a continuous cable that had to be about 2,000 miles long. It felt about as impossible as building a space elevator to the moon. And at the time, scientists were still discovering some of the basic laws of physics that we take for granted today. Electric currents were being used for a lot of stuff in 1858, but electricity still wasn't understood very well. And this meant that a lot of the ideas that people had for how to run an electric pulse along a cable for a long distance, they were literally just guesses. And the only way to prove or disprove this theory was to build the thing, which was going to be very expensive. But fortunately, Cyrus Field was very rich, and he was very ignorant and had no idea how impossible this was supposed to be. So he went ahead and kind of Elon Muskishly hired a team to get it done. One of the other people that Field hired to be on the board of his Atlantic Telegraph Company was this young man, whose name was William Thompson. He had fewer cool names and fewer credentials than Whitehouse at this point in time, but he was also a keen physicist with some interesting new ideas about how electrical currents worked. Cyrus Field had discovered Thompson after he wrote a bunch of proposals for how to build the telegraph cable. He's basically a Reddit troll. And Field liked his spirit, so he hired the guy. And when Whitehouse met Thompson, it was rivalry at first sight. Whitehouse was used to being listened to, and Thompson was younger than him and questioning his authority, and Thompson had his own measure of respect with the board, and his facial hair wasn't as good. Although later in life he would grow a beard so magnificent that it would make a hipster weep to see it. It's pretty cool, I think. So anyway, the main point of contention about how to build this thing was how the cables themselves were going to be constructed. They needed to be designed so that they could hold up to the distance that they had to cover and still carry a signal. Whitehouse argued that the copper that was used to conduct the signals should have a small diameter, but that the voltage that was used to carry that signal should be very strong, kind of like yelling the current across the distance between the two oceans. And he'd also decided that the cable should be very heavy, so that it would sink to the ocean floor and it wouldn't move about and it would be fine. It would stay there. And Thompson disagreed with him about pretty much everything I just said. But Whitehouse was confident that he was right, and he was more senior, and he refused to hear any of Thompson's ideas. And there wasn't much time to persuade stubborn people like Whitehouse that there were other points of view besides his. Because Cyrus Field and the board also wanted this project to be completed as soon as possible because they'd gotten all their investors really excited, and also most of the people in England and America. And that's a lot of people. And they wanted it delivered yesterday. So they rushed out this cable using Whitehouse's design. The way they did this, they stuck two halves, two ships, one half on each ship. One of these ships was going to spool the cable out from across the sea from Newfoundland, and the other ship was going to do the same from Western Ireland. And the idea was that they would sail across the sea, spooling the cable out behind them. They would meet in the middle, join up the cable, and hey, you've got a working telegraph line. But yeah, no, it didn't work out like that. This picture shows how they loaded the cables into the ships. They basically made a little bridge to roll them along because the cables weighed about an imperial ton a mile, so they couldn't just be carried. And Whitehouse's health at this time wasn't so good. So this meant that Thompson was the one who had to get on the ship and actually go and carry Whitehouse's cable across the sea and spool it across the Atlantic Ocean. So he had to oversee the whole thing. Whitehouse remained on shore and waited. And the first attempt was a total disaster. After about 3 days, the incredibly expensive cable snapped under its own weight and sank to the bottom of the ocean and was lost forever. So Field went and made his excuses to the investors. He got some more money to build a replacement cable, which is what they're doing in this picture. In this one, they're covering the cables with a layer of what they called gutta percha, which was a tree sap. It is a tree sap that could be molded soft, and then it would harden like plastic. And this was before plastic had been invented. So the Victorians used gutta percha for everything, to the point where the tree nearly went extinct. And then they invented plastic, and that saved the tree. Whether it saved the world, anyway. After about a year of very expensive cable making, the new cable was ready. They put it on the ships and they set out again. But this time, the idea was that the two ships would start in the middle of the Atlantic and they would go towards the coast from there. And it took them 3 more tries, meeting in the middle and sailing out again. And every single time, the cable snapped and sank. And at one point, the cable was almost completely destroyed by a passing whale, which you can see here. This was the original fail whale. Thank you. But by the 4th attempt, they had made it the whole way across without the cable breaking. And it was connected to the local telegraph networks at both ends and declared ready for business. And this was the point where the entire Western world went completely wild and they kicked off that go-live party that we talked about earlier. This was also where Wildman Whitehouse sealed his own fate. He and Thompson had argued over how the cable had been designed, and now they were fighting over how it should be operated. Because as I said earlier, Whitehouse had designed the system to generate a very strong current along the entire length of the line. And Thompson had managed to get him to put some brakes on the voltage of that. And so that had worked. The system wasn't generating nearly as much power as it could, which actually, in terms of physics, is better, but they didn't know that at that point. But as the weeks went on, demand for the telegraph grew and grew. It's like the only line, and you would have to send one message at a time across the line. So there are messages backing up at both ends of the line from entire continents. So Whitehouse, thinking, fiddling and waiting, decided to increase the voltage as high as he could make it, in prod, without telling anyone. His expectation was that the stronger the current, the faster and clearer the messages would get to the other end of the line. The reality was that this amount of voltage completely fried the extremely expensive cables. He'd overwhelmed them with power, which meant that they had short-circuited into the sea, and some nearby sharks had boiled fish for dinner. So the upshot of Whitehouse's secret tinkering with the system meant that his famous cable was completely dead within 3 weeks of going live, and the world was very angry. And so was Cyrus Field, and so was the entire board of the Atlantic Telegraph Company, because they literally had one job. It was in the name. They hadn't managed to do it. This is about as pretty much as big a disaster as if the entire internet had gone down, and they didn't know if they were going to get it back. When a project fails this spectacularly, and when this much money is involved, there's usually a lot of public head-scratching and soul-searching about what went wrong and where it went wrong. Questions get asked, And as you'd probably expect, the best companies will take some time out to step back and reflect on what's happened and see what lessons they can learn to make it better. And while most of the board of the Atlantic Telegraph Company were doing this, the one man who wasn't was Edward Orange Wildman Whitehouse, because he had skipped right across that period of reflection and right into blame, which is a pit that it's unfortunately very easy to fall into. He didn't want to reflect, because he knew whose fault it was, everybody else's except for him. And the public was so angry with the failure of this cable that it demanded, and it got, a public inquiry into the whole project. This was one of the first project retrospectives that took place in front of an entire country. During this inquiry, William Thompson testified to the reams of his advice that had been ignored by the chief electrician, and others stepped in to testify to the fact that they had seen the chief electrician messing with the voltage levels on the cable in the weeks after its completion, which was completely against what the board had decided to do and against all known scientific advice. So getting feedback like this is always a bit of a blow, especially when you thought you were doing a good job. And getting feedback like this publicly is even harder, because it's natural to get defensive when this happens. And honestly, public feedback about specific individuals is not usually a great idea. But that's what happened. And it's not usually a great idea because it often leads to situations like what followed after this. Whitehouse hadn't entered into this inquiry with an open mind, but honestly, he hadn't entered into the entire project with an open mind. He was a self-righteous Victorian-era gentleman and a scientist and a doctor and a member of the Royal Society, and he was used to being treated as though that meant he could do whatever he wanted. Unfortunately for Whitehouse, there was no software development community in 1858 to suggest to him how he might tactfully handle that situation. So he did what an angry, self-righteous Victorian-era gentleman scientist would do. He published a pamphlet about the whole affair. And then he sent it to all the papers, and he had it published there, too. The pamphlet was called The Atlantic Telegraph, but a better title might have been Everyone is Wrong Except Me, the Greatest Scientist in the World. I could describe what was in it, but I'm going to let Whitehouse speak for himself here because it's better. The charges leveled against my ignorant unsuspicion are three. Three of the most derogatory and detrimental, not merely to the fame of a public, but to the character of a private man. In the one case, however, error is but human. In the other, disgrace. From the first, my advice and wishes as projector had been disregarded and overruled, and as an officer, I had constantly been thwarted and obstructed in my operations. I do not shrink, therefore, from the avowal that, accustomed to such treatment and aware of the incompetence and division of counsel existing on the board, I decided to do my best on my own responsibility to save the enterprise from destruction. I make no appeal ad misericordiam. I seek for no sympathy on scientific grounds. Sufficient for me that I have been identified, and from the first, with that prodigy of this age, which may become a new starting point in history until the end of time. A great responsibility rests upon those who have in any way contributed to the failure of this enterprise. But for my own part, I can safely say that neither zeal, labor, caution, nor anxiety was wanting upon the part of Edward Orange Wildman Whitehouse. And then he signed it. It may surprise you to learn that publishing this pamphlet did not really convince anyone that the failure of the telegraph cable was not somehow his fault. At any rate, it certainly convinced lots of people that whether or not the cable had been ruined because of Whitehouse's failure to listen to anybody else, they sure as hell did not want to work with that guy. And after this, he was unasked to be chief electrician of the Atlantic Telegraph Company, which was fine by him because he didn't want to work with them anyway. And then he folded his arms and he stormed off to his room or something. Unfortunately, I have seen many projects, even in this day and age, end just that way. And this is a real shame, because in 1858, it was already obvious that this was a really bad way to run a team. There are a few things I want to highlight out of this telegraph cable affair that I think are pretty important. Firstly, Open-mindedness among your team is crucial to success, but it is also crucial to good failure. Constructive reflection can't happen if there are members of your team who aren't open to being challenged or having their minds changed, even by people who are considered junior to them. Secondly, if the project gets to the point that things are really bad, feedback should be given sensitively and with tact, and most importantly, privately. People are naturally going to get defensive if they think that they're being attacked, especially if they think that they are having their value challenged in public. Thirdly, in order to be effective, retrospectives should always follow the prime directive, which is this one here. Regardless of what we discover, we understand and truly believe that everyone did the best job they could, given what they knew at the time, their skills and abilities, the resources available, and the situation at hand. Having something like this to guide a retrospective session creates a safe space for reflection where people can openly discuss failures without fear of blame. It's also a good reminder for anyone in the retro that blame is not appropriate. I like to print this one out and put it on a wall before a start of a retro. I find it can really help. It might help you too. And finally, there is no room for hero behavior in a strong team. The story of the first transatlantic telegraph cable project might have been very different if that team didn't include Wildman Whitehouse. And while there were definitely problems with the way that the inquiry after the failure of the cable was handled, they may not have even needed an inquiry if they had appointed someone else to be chief electrician instead. One of the strongest findings of the inquiry was that Whitehouse's behavior was a real problem, and most particularly his inability to listen to anybody else, and his tendency to run off on his own and make crucial changes to this project without telling anyone else. And occasionally you will get people on teams who want to be seen as heroes, because our culture often romanticizes this idea of someone who swoops in and saves the day right at the end. And all this is really cool if you're Batman. But if you've ever watched a Batman movie, you'll see how many innocent people get their legs broken and how many buildings get completely destroyed while he's chasing after a bad guy. And the same thing happens with heroes on projects. They might get some personal glory once it's done, but the team members who ended up with bits of smashed building crushing their parked cars are not going to remember that person very fondly, and they probably won't want to work with them again. This makes for a terrible team environment, and we all know that unhappy teams do not do good work. Here is a quick recap of all of that in case you missed any of it. Firstly, open-mindedness is crucial. Secondly, treat feedback sensitively. Thirdly, remember the prime directive. And fourth, there's no room for heroes. So, with the moral of this story over, you might be wondering what happened to the Telegraph cable project after the dramatic pamphlet incident. And you'll be pleased to learn that the Atlantic Telegraph Company learned something about teamwork from their first iteration. They appointed William Thompson as the chief electrician. This was great, because in addition to having far more solid ideas about physics than his predecessor, he was also nicer to work with, and he knew how to treat his team with respect. And at this point, the Western world's demand for a transatlantic telegraph cable was so large, and at this point, the Atlantic Telegraph Company had had so much experience laying cable out at sea that they didn't have that much problem getting money to try again. This time, they built the cables the exact opposite of Whitehouse's. They were large in diameter, not quite so heavy, so they could be a little flexible in the sea currents and hopefully wouldn't cause themselves to snap. And they used a comparatively tiny amount of voltage to power them. And then they put them on the boat, and they went out to sea, and they sailed off, and the cable snapped again. But because they had been through this so many times by now, Thompson and his crew knew enough that they were able to fish that cable back up from the ocean floor and repair it. And they went back for a second cable, and by that time the second cable had reached both coasts, they hooked the repaired first one up too. And then they had 2 working telegraph lines across the Atlantic. And they actually worked. And after they had tested it to make sure that it really, really, really worked, then the whole Western world had another wild go-live party. And eventually, they laid undersea telephone lines, and even more eventually, there were undersea fiber optic cables, and video chat, and cat gifs, and we all lived happily ever after in an interconnected world. The end.
Let's give Lily one last round of applause.